In this lesson, we'll look at a common trap in the answer choices of listening questions. These answers include keywords or information that you heard, but don't match the question being asked. If you watched all the lessons on the reading section, you've seen this same type of trap before. Wrong detail traps in the listening section are basically the same as the ones in the reading section. They include information that actually appeared in the recording, but that information does not answer the question you're being asked. Often, the detail comes from earlier or later in the listening passage, not from the part that matters most. These answers are tempting because they sound familiar. One key difference from the reading section is that you can't look back at the text. You have to rely on what you remember hearing and how it connects to the question. That makes it especially important to stay focused on what the question is asking, not only what sounds familiar. Let's look again at an example announcement from a museum, which we heard in an earlier lesson. When we listened to this, we heard several details: what the exhibit is about, where it's located, when it closes, and information about guided tours. It's a short recording, but there's a lot of information. And here's a detail question that you might see after listening to that announcement. Why might visitors need to plan ahead? This question is not asking about general information from the announcement, or for any guessing. It's asking for specific information connected to planning. Let's analyze this question next to the transcript of the announcement. On your test, you won't be able to do this, of course, but it helps illustrate the trap and why it's dangerous. Every answer choice mentions something related to the announcement. Answers A and C are both about tours. The man did mention tours at the end of the announcement. Answer B is about the closing time. And again, the man did mention the time that the exhibit closes. If you choose based on recognition alone, it's easy to pick the wrong answer. Each answer choice has key words that connect to the recording. But let's take a step back. What is the question actually asking? This is an important habit for avoiding wrong detail traps. Focus on the question itself more than the answer choices. The question asks why visitors might need to plan ahead. All of the answer choices include tempting details and keywords, but only one of them matches that specific question about planning ahead. When we answer, we need to be sure the connection is very clear. When you look back at the announcement with that question in mind, only one sentence addresses planning directly. Visitors may experience brief lines due to high interest. This is the only detail that matters. All of the others are just distractions for this specific question. When you match the question to that highlighted detail, the correct answer becomes clear. The reason visitors may need to plan ahead is that there could be a wait to gain entry. This answer repeats the same information that we heard. Of course, it's more difficult on the real test because you can't read the transcript, and you need to rely on your memory. Luckily, most wrong answer choices are also wrong for other reasons. Let's look again at those answer choices and see more about why they are wrong. The keywords from the recording make them tempting, but they have other problems. Answer choice A uses the word only, which is too extreme. The man mentioned tours, but didn't say that the exhibit was only available through a tour. Answer choice C is similar, but also includes totally new information about students. The man in the announcement didn't say anything at all about students. And finally, answer choice B may be tempting because of the details on closing time, but it mixes up topics. The new exhibit will close at 6 p.m., but that doesn't mean the museum as a whole will close early. We don't know anything about what time the museum will close, just the specific exhibit. To sum it up, wrong detail answers reuse information you heard, but apply it incorrectly. Matching keywords is not enough, because correct answers depend on how details answer the question. Always read the question carefully before looking at the choices, and be alert for distorted details, extreme language, or new information. Focusing and double-checking on the question first is the most reliable way to avoid this trap. In this lesson, we're going to look at inference questions on the TOEFL listening section. These questions ask you to understand meaning that is not directly stated, but is suggested by the speaker. That may sound challenging, but don't worry. They aren't about guessing or reading minds. They're about using careful listening and clear clues. Inference questions ask what the speaker means even if they don't say the exact words. The question might ask what can be inferred, what the speaker implies, what the professor suggests, or what someone will probably do next. The key idea is that the answer is never random. It comes from strong clues in the audio. If you hear those clues clearly, the correct answer will feel like an obvious conclusion based on what was actually said. The TOEFL isn't a test of logic, just language, so you don't need to solve a puzzle here. These questions test whether you can connect the speaker's words with the larger meaning behind them. Often, speakers show their attitudes or intentions through tone or short comments rather than long explanations, and inference questions check whether you notice those signals. You may need to combine a few pieces of information. such as a description, an example, or a reaction, to understand what the speaker is really communicating. Right, so let's take a look at what kinds of inferences you'll be expected to make. There are a few common types of inferences on the test. For one, you might need to understand a speaker's attitude or opinion, even if they never say it directly. For example, they might say, "I don't know, that sounds challenging." And you can infer that they are nervous, even if they didn't say, "I'm nervous," in exact words. Similarly, you may need to identify an unstated reason for something the speaker describes, or recognize a conclusion that is probably true based on the recording. Sometimes the question focuses on a phrase that suggests something indirectly, and you have to explain what that phrase really means in context. Now, we're walking through these just to show the types of relationships. There aren't separate strategies for these, and there may be different types of inferences on your test, but hopefully this gives a general sense of what inference means for the TOEFL. As you listen, to make a good inference, pay close attention to the speaker's tone. Are they frustrated, uncertain, pleased, or something else? Also, notice when the speaker emphasizes something or repeats it, because that can be an important hint. Similarly, contrasting statements can show disagreement or doubt, which often leads to an inference. And finally, and most importantly, use only the information from the listening passage. Inference does not mean adding outside knowledge. It means connecting the clues already given. Let's take a look at some of the common types of wrong answers. A lot like other question types, the wrong answers to inference questions often look tempting because they sound logical, but they just don't match the recording perfectly. Some choices add new information the speaker never mentioned, while others repeat key words but change the meaning slightly. You'll also see answers that are too strong, using words like always, never, or must, even when the speaker only hinted at something. These patterns are helpful to recognize so you don't choose an answer that goes beyond the audio. Now let's listen to an example from the same academic talk we've used in other lessons. Here's the transcript again for reference. Feel free to pause the video and look for times when the professor is suggesting information indirectly, not just the definitions and examples as said, but what other potential facts that we could assume are true based on what's here. Okay, when you're ready, we'll look at the question that follows. Here's an example of a question we might get from that talk. What can be inferred about how people handle information that conflicts with their worldviews? Each answer choice offers a different possibility, but only one fits the clues in the passage. So, pause the video, and then take a minute to scan the answers and see if you can find the correct one. All right, now let's go back one more time to the transcript. The question asked about how people handle information that conflicts with their worldviews. The professor talks about that about halfway through the recording, so here's the relevant section. The key sentence says, people overlook contradicting evidence. The inference here is small, even though the professor doesn't talk much about conflicting evidence. She mostly talked about how people tend to believe supporting evidence. We can take that same idea and apply it to the opposite. They are less likely to believe contradicting evidence. Coming back to our answer choices, let's look at what makes the wrong answers incorrect. The first is basically the opposite of the truth. The professor said that people overlook conflicting evidence, not that they pay more attention to it. The second and third choices add ideas that just weren't in the recording. Whether people understand the conflicting evidence and how much context they have isn't discussed. Similarly, the professor doesn't say anything about how well we remember anything, just what we pay attention to and what we believe is true. The final answer choice is our correct one. The professor said that people more likely believe evidence that matches their existing ideas. That means they're less likely to believe evidence that does the opposite, that contradicts their existing views. To summarize, inference questions ask you to understand meaning that the speaker suggests but does not say directly. Good inferences are based on clear clues such as tone, examples, emphasis, and contrast. Wrong answers often add new ideas or exaggerate what the speaker said. Strategy can help you stay focused, but the real key is careful listening. If you pay attention to how the speaker builds their ideas, you'll be able to recognize the small jumps in meaning that inference questions rely on. Just be sure to keep your inferences small. Don't bring your own expectations into the answers, just what you actually heard. Welcome to this lesson on daily life announcement tasks in the TOEFL listening section. In this task type, you'll hear a short announcement from a single speaker in an everyday location, and you'll answer questions that focus on practical information. We'll look at what these announcements sound like, what they test, and how to listen for the most important details. Altogether, these recordings aren't too different from the conversations. They're also daily life, which means they're not limited to the types of topics you would hear at a university. The announcements are short, single speaker recordings, usually around 20 to 30 seconds. They often come from places like museums, stores, transit stations, or campus buildings. The speaker typically gives both information and instructions. And just like all TOEFL listening tasks, there is no replay, so you'll need to be fully focused from the beginning so you don't miss important details. In these announcements, you can expect three main elements. First is the purpose of the announcement, why the speaker is talking at all. Then you'll hear key details, especially about time, location, or any changes to normal schedules and options. Finally, most announcements include suggestions, warnings, or requests that help listeners know what to expect or how to prepare for the event or change that was announced. As for what they test, like all TOEFL listening, they are about general meaning, not specific vocabulary, slang, or difficult pronunciation. The recordings are clear and simple, and the questions ask you to understand the main reason for the announcement and whether you can identify important details, like when something is happening or where to go. The content is key, and the TOEFL won't make that content hard to understand as long as you stay focused. When you take notes, keep them extremely short, only times, locations, etc. It's okay to take no notes at all. It's more dangerous to miss key information because you were writing than it is to skip the notes. Now let's hear an example announcement from a museum. When the recording begins, focus immediately on the purpose of the message. Is there an event being announced? Or is there a change of schedule, or a building that is closing? Other than that, listen for specific details, such as times and places, and pay attention to any advice the speaker gives. Things like plan ahead or expect delays. These clues usually connect directly to the questions you'll answer afterward. Listen to an announcement at a museum.
Attention visitors. We're pleased to announce that our new Oceans Through Time exhibit opens today. It features rare fossils, interactive displays, and short films about marine evolution. The exhibit is located in Hall C and will be open until 6 p.m. Due to high interest, you may experience brief lines, so please plan accordingly. Guided tours begin every hour at the entrance.
All right, and that's it. Again, it's quite short, and there are just a couple key details. Now that we've heard it, let's summarize that example. In the questions that come after, the test will likely ask about the purpose of the announcement, details of the event or change, or the recommendations that the speaker gives. Go ahead and pause this video for a bit to give your answers to these general questions. Okay, great. Before we show the answers to those questions, we'll take a look at the transcript, what the speaker actually said. Here we go. Here's the full transcript. The man announced a new museum exhibit about the oceans and how they have changed over time. He gives some details about what is included in the exhibit and where and when it's available. Then, at the end, he mentions there will likely be a wait to enter the exhibit because there will be brief lines. Finally, there's a small detail about when there will be tours. With that in mind, let's go back and check our answers to the questions. The purpose was to announce the opening of the new Oceans Through Time exhibit. Key details included the location in Hall C and the closing time of 6 p.m. The announcement also gave a suggestion. Visitors should expect a wait to enter. Any of these details could show up in the two questions that would follow this announcement. And that's all there is to it. The announcements require careful listening because they're short and have a bit of detail. Focus on the purpose, those details, and any suggestions or changes the speaker mentions. Don't worry about taking long notes, or maybe don't take notes at all. Just listen carefully and try to find the context, the key information, and the recommendations, if any, are given. The question type that we'll talk about in this lesson is similar to a couple of others, especially main idea and function questions. We'll be talking about purpose questions, which ask why a discussion or announcement happened. They are not focused on specific details, but instead on the intention and context. Purpose questions ask why the speaker is talking, what they are trying to accomplish in the moment. These questions focus on the speaker's intention rather than the topic itself, which means you often have to think about the situation or tone, not only the words being said. They appear most frequently in daily life conversations and announcements, where the reason for speaking is usually tied to a practical need or specific goal. Similar to inference questions, the exact purpose might not be spoken exactly, but there won't be any tricks or logic to figure it out. You don't have to read people's minds, just hear what they actually said. Okay, so that means we need to interpret what the speaker wants or needs, even if it isn't stated directly. Tone is important for that. whether the speaker is asking for something, offering information, giving a warning, apologizing, or trying to solve a problem. Most answer choices will have key words that you hear, but having similar details isn't enough. The bigger picture is important here. As for how to prepare yourself for these questions, it's similar to main idea questions. You'll want to pay special attention to the beginning of the recording to understand the situation, because speakers often reveal their intention immediately, true in both conversations and announcements. Tone and words about emotions can be important clues. If the person is apologetic, for example, says something that sounds like a warning, that helps give context. And also similar to main idea questions, we have some common ways that incorrect answers are written. Specific details from the recording will appear, but they don't match up to the overall purpose. You'll also see answers that exaggerate feelings or motives the speaker never expresses, such as adding frustration when the tone is neutral. Other times, a single word or phrase from the listening will be turned into something completely different from the purpose. Notice these patterns in incorrect answer choices as you practice, and then they'll be a bit easier to ignore on test day. Now let's go back to the audio that we heard in the lesson about daily life announcements. If you haven't heard that audio, you might want to go back to that lesson first before continuing with this one. If you have heard it, here's the transcript, which we'll use to analyze and answer a purpose question. Pause the video here to read through the transcript in either case. All right, when you're ready, let's move on to an example. As always, remember that on the actual test, you won't be able to read like this, just listen, but it's helpful as we learn the test to analyze in writing. So, after we hear that announcement, we might get a purpose question that looks like this. Notice that some keywords are similar to the text. The first answer choice mentions a schedule, for example. And we did hear some details on times in the announcement. But let's go back to that transcript and look more closely at the first couple sentences in particular. Here's the script again with one key sentence highlighted. Right at the beginning, the speaker says, "We're pleased to announce that our new Oceans Through Time exhibit opens today." Even though he mentions guided tours and potential lines, those are just details. They are not the main purpose. Also note the word pleased here. That tone word will be helpful when looking at the answer choices. Now let's take another look at the question and its answer choices. The correct answer is B. The speaker was pleased to announce the new part of the museum. Collection, in this context, is very similar to the word exhibit. The other options do use relevant keywords, but the focus is too narrow, or the details are distorted. And again, the phrase pleased to announce is an important one. The speaker probably wouldn't be pleased about A, B, or D. Those are all negative or neutral. To wrap up, purpose questions ask why the speaker is talking, and they ask you to think about intention, not just hearing a detail. The beginning of the recording and the speaker's tone are often the clearest clues. Be careful with answer choices that describe the topic instead of the purpose or add motivations that weren't expressed. This isn't a test of remembering all the details, but instead of understanding context. As always, the most important part is paying close attention while you listen. These aren't trick questions. The answers will be pretty clear if you hear and understand everything. In this lesson, we'll take a closer look at the choose a response question type, which appears at the beginning of each listening module. These are a new type of question introduced for the 2026 version of the TOEFL, and are one of the question types that focus on everyday English, not academic material. They're super short, so there isn't a ton of strategy involved, but there are some key things to pay attention to that we'll cover. For the choose a response questions, your job is to choose the most natural and logical reply based on what you'd realistically say in the same situation after you hear a single sentence or question. To do that, you need to imagine the context, even though you only hear one short line. For example, if someone says, "My phone died, can I borrow your charger for a minute?" You should think about what a helpful, appropriate response would sound like. The answer to a question like that could of course just be yes, but the answer choices on the TOEFL won't be quite as simple. They'll add a little more context or use more detailed conversational language, like, "No problem, I'm not using it right now." Even so, they're a pretty simple kind of question. All right, so let's talk about what these questions are really measuring. The choose a response items focus on whether you understand the intention behind the speaker's words, essentially, why they said what they said. These questions also check your familiarity with common idioms, everyday expressions, and the kinds of conversational responses native speakers naturally give. Unlike academic listening tasks, these recordings rely on daily life English rather than technical vocabulary or long explanations. Okay, So how do they sound? We'll hear an example in just a minute, but first a quick overview. These recordings are very short, around 5 seconds long, and are spoken in clear, scripted English. You'll only hear one speaker, and importantly, you cannot replay the audio. That means that paying attention is super important. Although many recordings include a direct question, not all of them do. Sometimes the speaker simply makes a statement, but it's always a statement that implies the speaker is waiting for a response. Let's take a look at our first sample question. You'll see something like this on your test. An image of a single person and a set of answer choices. The audio will play at the same time, so you won't have time to read the answer choices first, and there's no reason to. There's no way to know what answer choices will be correct until you listen first. So let's hear it.
My phone died. Can I borrow your charger for a minute?
So that's super short, right? If you're not paying careful attention, it's easy to simply not hear the audio and get stuck. And if we look at the answer choices, we'll see some that have similar keywords like ringtone, message, and charged. There's a lot of language about phones, so simply hearing phone and charger in the audio isn't enough. You need to hear the whole thing. Here's what the woman said in the clip. From among the answer choices, the correct answer is B, because it answers the speaker's request to borrow a phone charger. The other choices are perfectly normal English, but they don't fit the situation behind the original line. Also notice that answer choice D doesn't answer the yes/no question. That's a common type of issue with the incorrect answer choices, so it can be helpful to listen for the type of question being asked. Let's look more deeply at that. There are basically 3 things that you need to listen for. The question type, if it's a question, the content words, and the tone words. The question type is an important one. Is the speaker asking a yes/no question like do you or is it? Or are they asking for information such as who, what, when, or where? But that alone won't be enough. As we saw in the example a minute ago, wrong answers might start with yes or no in response to a yes/no question. So we need a bit more. That's where content words matter. Phrases like my phone died give you clues about the situation. And finally, the tone can be important as well. Tone words like I'm afraid that can show emotions, and the response you choose should match them. Now that you know what to listen for, let's discuss how to use that information in practice. Listen for the speaker's intention. Are they making a request, asking a question, or offering something? Remember that even if a question sounds like a yes/no question, the correct response may not be a simple yes or no. Instead, it might include extra context or a helpful follow-up. So guessing what the answer should be doesn't work. You need to read all the choices carefully. And an important note, remember that the biggest challenge with these questions is how fast they are. Staying focused is key. Let's take a look at another short example to apply the strategy.
I think this table will need to move a bit to the left.
Now pause the video and choose your response. Okay, let's take a look at the answer. The speaker said that a table needs to be moved a little to the left, which means he's probably moving furniture. The correct answer is A. Lend a hand is a phrase that means to help, so this answer choice works. The man is moving a table, and you offer to help. On the other hand, the other options have some similar key words, but they don't match with the context of moving a table. Notice this example isn't a question, so the strategy of listening for question types doesn't work. We really need to hear the content and understand the situation. Although most of the people who you hear will ask questions, not all of them will. To summarize, these choose a response items are short, fast, everyday listening tasks that check your ability to understand the speaker's intention and respond appropriately. To do well, focus on identifying the question type, noticing key content words, and paying attention to tone. Make sure to read all answer choices carefully and stay focused. Getting distracted is the biggest danger here. These are usually pretty easy questions, but losing focus can make them impossible to answer confidently. In this video, we're going to focus on a very practical skill for the choose a response questions, using question words to help you choose the best response. This question type is very simple, so the strategies you can use are limited, but this strategy can help with many of the choose a response questions, so it's an important one to cover. Most choose a response prompts are questions, and a large majority of those questions use who, what, when, where, why, or how. We call those open-ended questions. These open-ended questions are about twice as common as simple yes or no questions. So it's not uncommon for half of the choose a response questions on a listening module to be open-ended. You might, for example, hear 5 open-ended questions, 3 yes/no questions, and 2 statements. So those question words like who, what, and when become pretty important. One of the fastest ways to eliminate wrong answers is to check whether the response actually matches the kind of information the question is asking for. A where question needs a location. A when question needs a time, and so on. If the answer doesn't match the question word, it can't be correct. Here are a few examples of open-ended questions you might hear. Notice that each one clearly signals the type of information the speaker wants: a place, a reason, or a time. As you listen, training yourself to immediately recognize that question word helps you predict what a correct answer should sound like before you even look at the options. Now let's take a look at a common type of trap. Note, by the way, that we'll look at all the examples in this lesson in writing, even though the TOEFL actually doesn't show you the text, only audio. But it's a bit easier to explain this clearly if we see it in writing. Just remember that when you practice, you will take these same skills from reading the questions and use them when listening. All right, with that in mind, take a moment to pause the video, read the question and the answer choices, and try to choose the best response yourself before moving on. In this example, a few answer choices mention ideas related to cars, keys, and parking, so they may sound connected to the question. But only one answer actually gives a location. This is a common trap. The content feels related, but it doesn't answer the question word, where. Matching the keywords is not enough. The answer has to match the question word. And notice that in this example, the question word alone is almost enough to solve the problem. Once you recognize that the question is asking where, you can eliminate any answer that gives a reason, an explanation, or unrelated information. This is one of the best ways to narrow your choices if you didn't fully hear the question or didn't understand all of the vocabulary. But that said, the question word isn't always enough. Here we have a new question, but I haven't written it all out yet, only the question word. And if we look at only the question word, we can't really find the answer. The second answer choice seems unlikely because it answers how long something takes, but the other three could all possibly be answers to a why question. So let's look at the whole question, including other keywords. Now we have the word why, but we also have start later. That part is equally important. The question word helps, but it doesn't solve everything. You still need to listen for content words that match the situation. But even if we didn't hear the whole question, we can at least eliminate the second answer choice. With that option removed, pause the video and try answering this question. The best strategy is to use both together. First, use the question word to eliminate answers that clearly don't fit. Then, use meaning and context to choose the option that actually explains the situation described in the question. In this case, why did it start later matches well with people didn't arrive in time. The other answers don't explain timing like the third answer choice does. But let's remember that not all choose a response prompts are open-ended. Question words aren't as helpful for yes-no questions. But there are some common patterns in yes-no questions that we can identify. Often, the best answer gives extra information instead of simply saying yes or no. Sometimes the yes or no is implied by the response. Imagine, for example, if somebody asks you, "Do you want some milk?" and you respond with, "I don't like milk." The answer is basically no, even though you didn't say the word no. And sometimes the question isn't actually a yes-no question at all, but instead a more polite, open-ended question like, "Do you know when?" When that happens, it's the word when that matters most, same as other open-ended questions. But in general, for yes-no questions, content matters more than the exact form of the answer. We'll see how that works with a few examples. First, let's take a look at an example of a direct yes-no question. Pause here and try answering this question yourself before continuing. Here, the correct answer directly responds to the question and even includes the word yes. But notice that the first answer also has the word no. That's not enough by itself. The rest of the content is important. The question shows that the person asking is looking for a place to be, in a line. The fourth answer choice says they are in the correct place, which matches. Moving on, we'll see a question where none of the answer choices say yes or no. Pause the video again and choose the best response before moving on. Even though none of the answers actually say yes or no, the fourth answer choice politely says that it's okay to open the window. This is very common in everyday English, and it's something the test expects you to recognize. And finally, let's look at an example of a response that doesn't say yes or no, but gives extra context. Pause here and try this final example on your own. Although a simple yes might have been a good answer to the question, in this case, that's not an option. But the first answer choice gives some context. The answer to the question depends on other information. If the person's class finishes in time, then they will go to the meeting. Notice that none of the other answer choices are about future plans. The first answer choice is the only one about the future. To summarize, open-ended questions are super common in choose a response tasks. Sometimes the question word alone is enough to find the answer, and when it's not, it still helps you eliminate wrong options quickly. Yes or no questions rely more on content and implied meaning than on the words yes or no themselves. So this strategy doesn't help with every question, but it can help with many. Training yourself to notice question words first will make those questions faster and easier, especially if you don't hear everything or understand the whole question. The choose a response questions in the listening section have some common themes and traps in wrong answers. You'll probably notice this yourself while practicing. Some questions are very similar to others. Understanding what they have in common can be helpful if the question words alone aren't enough. First, it's important to understand that not all choose a response prompts are the same. About two-thirds of them ask for information, and these are often open-ended questions using words like who, what, where, or when. The remaining questions fall into other categories, such as opinions, invitations, requests, statements, or verification. Recognizing the type of prompt you're hearing is a helpful step for choosing the right response. Even if you didn't hear or understand some vocabulary, you might still know, for example, that you just heard an invitation. And in that case, the correct answer has to be a good response to an invitation. Here are examples of different prompt types. All of these examples are about the same topic, going to a movie, but they are different types of questions, so the response that matches will be different for each of them. The first asks for information about when a movie begins. So the correct answer to that question should either be a time or a statement saying that you don't know when the movie begins, or something like that. The next example here asks for an opinion, so the answer needs to have that opinion. Each of these expects a different kind of response, even if some of the vocabulary is similar. Let's take a closer look at one of those examples. Take a moment to pause the video and try answering this question yourself before continuing. The question asks how someone liked the movie, which is asking for their opinion. All of the answer choices could be related to movies, but only one gives an opinion. The correct answer is the last one, choice D. Notice that choices A and B do have movie vocabulary, so they may sound connected, but only one answer actually expresses an opinion about a movie. The first answer choice does give an opinion, but it's about an actor, not a specific movie. This shows why matching keywords alone isn't enough. You need to match both the type of response the question is asking for and the topic. Now let's practice identifying content types. Each of these sentences fits into a different category: statement, opinion, invitation, request, or verification. Don't focus on the exact words yet. Focus on what the speaker is doing with the language. Take a moment to pause the video and try to categorize these questions. Here are the correct content types for each example. Notice that questions don't always look like questions, and statements don't always sound serious. What matters is the intention, not just the sentence structure. The first example isn't a question, but it does talk about a problem. The response to that would probably give a solution to the problem. Now let's try matching content and tone with one more example. Pause the video and try answering this question on your own before moving on. The speaker is checking whether communication has happened, so the response needs to address that directly. This slide highlights what the question is really about. It's about communication, something that happened or didn't happen in the past. The answer might include a yes or no, or it might give information that implies a yes or no answer, even if not said exactly. With that in mind, let's look again at the answer choices. As we look at those, notice two things. First, how verb tense plays a role. The correct answer is in the past tense with the word got. A couple of the other answers don't match that. Answer choice B is in the present tense, about a general truth. Answer choice C is in the present continuous tense, about something that is happening right now. And second, notice the key words. The first is about communication, about a phone call. Other options mention people or activities, not about communication. All of the pieces need to match. We can't just rely on verb tense or keywords alone. To summarize, most choose a response questions ask for information, but many involve other types of content like opinions, requests, or verification. The correct answer must match the type of question and the speaker's intention, not just share keywords. Pay attention to tone, content type, and verb tense to choose the best response more confidently. All right. Let's now look at the biggest part of the TOEFL listening test, the academic task. These recordings are short lecture-style explanations, only a minute long or so, delivered by a single professor or expert. We'll take a look at some strategy and the types of content you can expect and hear a realistic example to practice with. In this task, you'll hear a short lecture or explanation, usually lasting between 60 and 90 seconds. Even though the subject matter is academic, topics like psychology, biology, economics, or art history, the recordings are designed to be understandable without any special background knowledge. They focus on one central idea rather than presenting a complex, multi-part lecture, and the delivery is clear and scripted rather than fast or conversational. They have a clear beginning, middle, and end, and provide examples and explanations regularly. Your goal is to notice how the information is organized and note the key ideas. The structure is nearly as important as the content itself. There will usually be 4 questions on academic talks, which measure whether you can understand the overall point of the lecture and pick out supporting information that helps explain it. You'll usually be asked about the main idea, as well as specific details that the professor uses to illustrate or clarify the concept. Some questions focus on function, why the professor brings up an example, makes a comparison, or tells a story. Others ask you to infer meaning based on clues in the talk, such as what a professor implies about a certain behavior or process. You will also need to hear how ideas relate to each other, including definitions, causes, and effects, or the way examples support an argument. It's not just about hearing and understanding individual sentences, but about following the overall logic. In terms of strategy, because academic talks follow a predictable pattern, one of the best strategies is to listen for the structure the professor uses. Most talks begin with an introduction that sets up the topic, followed by an explanation or definition, and then one or more examples that make the idea more concrete. Pay close attention to transitions like, for instance, on the other hand, or another example, because they signal shifts in the professor's focus. It also helps to take short notes, just a few keywords in order, so you don't lose the big picture. Technical vocabulary shouldn't worry you because the professor usually defines them right away. The most important parts to listen for are the examples and definitions, since these are what the questions tend to target. When the talk begins, you might hear an example or a story to introduce the concept, or you might hear the key vocabulary and a definition. In either case, think about the big picture early. There will usually be a question that asks, what was the talk mainly about? The beginning of the recording often helps answer that. After the introduction, listen carefully for the examples used to illustrate the idea, since these examples also often appear directly in the questions. Comparisons or contrasts can also help clarify the meaning, so note any cases where the professor explains what something is not, or how it differs from another idea. Pay attention to reasons or causes the professor mentions, because they often reveal why the concept matters, or how it works in real situations. Most academic talks end with a brief concluding comment, and that final line usually summarizes the main point in a very clear way, helpful both for understanding the talk and for answering main idea questions. Now let's listen to an example of an academic talk. As we play the audio, try to notice how the professor sets up the topic, how she uses specific examples to explain it, and how those examples connect to the main idea. Be prepared to take some notes while you listen. Once the recording finishes, we'll take a moment to reflect on what we heard before moving on. Listen to a talk in a psychology class.
Recently, a friend told me she always chooses mid-priced options on restaurant menus because they feel like the safest choice. She isn't getting recommendations or considering ingredients. She just takes a mental shortcut to her decision, landing on whatever sits between the cheapest and most expensive items. That kind of thinking is a great example of what psychologists call a cognitive bias. Cognitive biases are heuristics that help us make quick judgments, but they often lead to predictable errors. Take confirmation bias, for instance. People naturally pay more attention to information that supports what they already believe and overlook contradicting evidence. If we hear a piece of information that matches our worldview, we're much more likely to think it's credible, regardless of the source. Another common bias is anchoring. When people see numbers, especially prices, say when looking at options while shopping for a car, they tend to rely heavily on the first number they encounter. So a salesperson showing you cars will usually start with a more costly option, making later ones seem inexpensive by comparison, even if they aren't exactly cheap. These biases are often minor, but they influence our choices in life constantly. Understanding them helps us avoid errors that otherwise might happen naturally.
Okay, that's it for the recording. If you've ever taken older versions of the TOEFL, you'll notice this one was shorter than they used to be. It's pretty limited to a single concept, so the structure is quite clear. As you think back on the talk, work through each part of the structure shown here. Consider the main idea of the lecture, what the entire talk was really about, and how the professor introduced that idea at the beginning. Identify the examples you heard, and think about how each example helped illustrate the concept. If the professor contrasted different ideas or behaviors, make note of that, because contrasts can highlight important distinctions. Finally, think about how the talk ended, since the conclusion often restates the point in a simpler way or reinforces why the concept matters. Take a minute to pause the video and try to answer these questions in your own words. These questions guide your listening and help you focus on the information most likely to appear in the test questions. Now that we've listened and tried to summarize ourselves, here is the full transcript of the academic talk you just heard. Reading it over helps confirm the structure and details that may have stood out during the audio. You'll see how the professor starts with a simple real-life example, choosing mid-priced items on a menu, to introduce the larger idea of cognitive biases. She then defines what a cognitive bias is, and follows with two examples of biases: confirmation bias and anchoring. As you read, notice how each paragraph builds on the previous one, ending with a short conclusion that explains why understanding these biases is helpful. This kind of structure is typical for academic talks. Expecting something similar can help you hear the main points on test day. So, returning to the questions that we asked ourselves, we can fill in some answers. The main idea was that cognitive biases influence the decisions people make. The introduction used a relatable restaurant example to show how mental shortcuts work. The professor then provided two types of biases: confirmation bias and anchoring, that demonstrate different ways people rely on quick judgments. In this talk, there weren't major contrasts, but the examples were distinct enough to show different types of biases. The conclusion emphasized that although these biases are small, they affect our choices all the time, and recognizing them can help us make better decisions. These are exactly the types of details the test questions will focus on. To finish up, remember that academic talks present one main concept, supported by clear examples. The structure is predictable, and the language is straightforward. So your job is to stay engaged and pick up the examples, definitions, and transitions that show how the professor is organizing the explanation. Technical vocabulary will always be defined, so pay attention to those definitions, and don't worry about not knowing the topic before test day. With light note-taking and focused listening, you'll have the talk's organization and main ideas in mind, and be prepared to answer the 4 questions that will follow. In this video, we'll be talking about the main idea questions in the TOEFL listening section. We'll look at what these questions ask, where they appear, and how to answer them. We'll be using an example question about the same recording you heard in the academic talks lesson. Main idea questions ask what the talk is mostly about, or they use a similar wording that focuses on the overall purpose or topic. These questions appear most often after academic talks, and they behave much like main idea questions in the reading section. Because they check whether you understood the general meaning, they are often the very first question asked after the audio clip. You should expect a couple of them on your test, usually 1 or 2 per module. Obviously, all questions matter on the TOEFL, because they all earn you points. But main idea questions are especially important, especially for academic talks, because your ability to answer them correctly will also influence other questions. If you don't understand the main idea, then it will be harder to answer questions about specific details as well. If you can state the main idea, then you're better prepared for all of the detail and function questions that follow. Focusing on the main idea also keeps you from getting lost in small pieces of information that aren't central to the talk. You can think of this as building a map of the recording, which makes the rest of the questions easier to complete correctly. When you're trying to find the main idea, the beginning and ending of the talk are especially important. Most speakers will introduce the topic clearly in the first few seconds, but sometimes there's an example or a short story, a detail to introduce the topic. Be careful about those. Introductory examples aren't the main idea itself. After the topic is introduced, pay attention to examples because they often point back to the main topic. You can also listen for repeated keywords or phrases, especially if the speaker defines them. Answer choices might not include the exact same words, but they will have synonyms, other words that mean the same thing. Before we go through an example, let's quickly talk about some common types of wrong answers. Some answers focus too closely on one specific detail, even though the recording covered a much broader point. Other options use the right keywords but twist them into a different topic. You'll also see choices that use the wrong tone, such as adding a negative attitude when the lecture was neutral. Keeping an eye out for these patterns will make eliminating wrong answers a bit easier. Now let's revisit the lecture about cognitive biases. We won't listen to the whole thing again. If you'd like to hear the recording, watch the lesson on academic talks. Instead, let's just look at the transcript to help remember it a bit. Feel free to pause the video here so you can scan or read it. But remember that on the actual test, you won't have a transcript, and you won't be able to replay the audio. You'll only have your notes and memory. Alright, when you're ready, let's move on to an example. Here is the main idea question that follows the talk. The actual question is very standard, just asking about the main topic. We can predict that the answer will be about cognitive biases. That was the topic of the lecture. Looking at the choices, notice how each answer focuses on a slightly different interpretation of the lecture. This is a good chance to think about which option best captures the overall topic and which ones focus too narrowly on supporting details. We'll walk through this example by comparing the choices to the transcript so you can see why the correct answer stands out. Okay, here's the full transcript of the talk one more time, with some key parts highlighted. The professor begins with a real-life example about choosing mid-priced items on a menu, but notice that's not the whole topic. She just uses that example to introduce the idea of cognitive biases, then moves on to explain two specific types, confirmation bias and anchoring. She ends by noting that although these shortcuts are small, they influence our choices constantly. This structure makes it easier to see that the talk's overall purpose is to explain how mental shortcuts shape decision-making. Now that you've seen the transcript again, look one more time at the answer choices. Some options focus on one specific example, such as restaurant pricing strategies, which is too narrow. The professor does talk about prices at restaurants, but only to introduce the larger topic. Others shift the tone or introduce ideas that weren't central to the talk. The third answer choice has a problem with tone. It makes a recommendation for what people should do. The lecture only defined and explained the topic. The professor didn't focus on what people should do. It's also too general, because it's about instinct versus expertise. The actual talk was more specifically about cognitive biases, not general instinct. And the final answer choice is a bit similar to the first in that it's too specific. The talk isn't just about shopping, even if shopping is discussed. Only the correct answer captures the broad theme that mental shortcuts, or cognitive biases, influence the decisions people make. To summarize, main idea questions ask what the recording is mostly about, and they rely on your ability to understand introductions, examples, and definitions. When you review the choices, avoid those that focus on details or distort the original tone of the lecture, and watch out for answers that add meaning or shift emphasis in a way that wasn't present in the clip. Most, if not all, of the answer choices will include key words that were in the recording, but the vocabulary isn't enough. The structure of the answer choice can significantly change its meaning. If you've understood the main idea well enough, you'll be prepared to answer the questions about more specific details that come next. In this lesson, we're going to look at function questions on the TOEFL listening section. These questions ask why a speaker says something specific. It could be a single sentence, a person's name, a phrase, or even a bigger piece, like a story told over multiple sentences. They're not asking about the topic as a whole, but instead about how one part contributes to the speaker's larger message. Most of the time, function questions ask why the speaker mentions a certain idea or uses a particular example. They can sometimes be a bit more focused on tone, but it's usually about content. So the question might say something like, why does the man mention this? Or why does the woman say this phrase? The goal is to understand how that piece fits into the bigger picture. Often in academic recordings, a professor will use a short story or everyday example to help explain a concept, and function questions check whether you made the connection between the example and the main topic. These questions can also appear in conversations, especially when idioms or emotional expressions help show how someone feels. You might hear somebody in a conversation say, "Are you sure about that?" for example, which shows that they're doubtful. As for what they test, you can basically break it up into two categories. Often, function questions test your understanding of how ideas connect. It's not enough to just hear the details of an example that are you need to understand what role it plays. Does it introduce a topic, clarify a definition, contrast two ideas, emphasize something important? But the second category is less about connection and more about tone. You might hear idioms or phrases that express surprise, excitement, disappointment, or other feelings. The test isn't asking you to guess hidden meaning. Instead, it's checking whether you can understand how the speaker uses a sentence or idea in context. To get any type of function question right, you need to hear and understand that context, not just the specific detail that the question asks about. There are several clear functions that appear again and again on the test. A speaker may use an example to show how a concept works in real life. They might use a contrast to highlight differences between two ideas. A sentence might serve as a definition or clarification, giving you a stronger understanding of the main topic. Sometimes the purpose is to explain a cause or to provide background information before introducing the main idea. And in many cases, the speaker uses a phrase to express a feeling, especially in daily life listening tasks. Now let's take a look at the types of traps that the wrong answer choices often include. Incorrect answers often go too far and include ideas that just aren't said in the audio. Others basically repeat the example that is asked about, without explaining how it connects to the bigger point. You'll also see options that focus too narrowly on one small detail or describe a function the speaker never used. For instance, saying the speaker is giving a warning when the tone is neutral. One helpful trick to catch these wrong answers is to pay special attention to the verb used. For instance, if the answer choice says to cast doubt, but the speaker never said anything doubtful, then that answer choice is probably wrong, regardless of what other words are used. Now let's go back to our example from an academic talk. Here's the transcript of the recording we heard in the lesson on these types of tests. If you want to revisit that lesson first to hear the audio, now is a good time to pause the video, go listen again, and come back. Otherwise, you can read through the whole transcript to remind yourself of the content. Okay, so at the beginning, the professor tells a short story about choosing mid-priced menu items, and then she moves into a discussion of cognitive biases. This is a pretty common structure on TOEFL listening, an example or story that introduces a bigger idea, and there is often a function question about an example like that. So then, let's take a look at a typical function question based on that example academic talk. Why does the professor mention her friend's restaurant habit? Each answer choice uses words that are generally connected to the topic of the talk, but only one of them explains the role of the example correctly. Again, it can be helpful to look at the verbs and words near them in the answer choices to show why, to illustrate how, to provide an example, and to introduce research. You may be able to eliminate some of the answer choices just by using those words. Now, let's return to the transcript and look at how the correct answer fits. Here is the beginning of the talk, when the professor talked about her friend's restaurant habit. After she tells the story, she says, that kind of thinking is a great example of cognitive bias. So the professor is using the story to provide a simple, everyday example of a cognitive bias. That's what we should be looking for in our answer choices. Finally, let's come back to the question and look at those answers, and why the incorrect ones are in fact wrong. The first has the wrong tone and purpose. The professor is not making an argument about the value of menu items. She is explaining an academic concept. The second answer choice, meanwhile, brings in ideas that aren't in the talk. Social pressure isn't mentioned at all. And the fourth answer choice is tempting because it says to introduce. And the professor does indeed introduce the topic with the story she tells. But it then says the topic is research on consumer preferences, which is not the main idea of the lecture. The only answer choice with the right verb and topic is answer choice C. Okay, now let's recap a bit. Function questions ask why the speaker says something specific, often a single sentence or an example or story. They require you to think about how different parts of the talk or conversation fit together. The most important clues come from the ideas before and after the specific detail that the question asked about, and sometimes from the speaker's tone. And when you look at the answer choices, pay careful attention to the verbs used. Sometimes those by themselves are enough to cross out some options and get closer to the correct choice.
ম্যাম আমাকে বলি কিন্তু ফাইনালি আসলে আমি এইভাবেই চিন্তা করি যারা আমার লাইফে থাকবে তারা হচ্ছে অবশ্যই প্রায়োরিটি থাকবে অবশ্যই এখানে তো গুরুত্ব না দেওয়াটা
This is the last type of question we'll look at for the listening section. Attitude questions. These questions ask you to understand how a speaker feels about a topic. They're pretty rare, but when they appear, they can be tricky because the answer can depend on tone and wording, not just simple facts. Attitude questions ask what a speaker is thinking or feeling about a topic. They are very similar to function questions, but instead of asking why someone says something, they ask about the speaker's opinion, reaction, or emotions. They are probably the rarest question type, and you may not see one on your test at all, but you should be prepared for them anyway. To answer these questions correctly, you need to pay attention to both what is said and how it's said, including tone of voice and word choice. The question format is usually very direct, asking about the speaker's attitude, opinion, or feeling toward a specific topic. They're easy enough to identify. There are two main types of clues for attitude questions. The first is the content, what the person actually says. For example, words like clearly indicate that the person is certain about something. Meanwhile, hesitating and repeating something might indicate that they are uncertain that the person they are talking to understands. The second category is their tone of voice. It might just be a single word that the speaker stresses. Or it could be a larger sense of emotion in their delivery. Tone of voice alone is not really tested, but it can give you a hint in combination with the actual words that are used. Let's look back at the sample conversation we've seen in other lessons. I'm going to replay this so we can hear the tone of voice, not just the content. Listen to a conversation.
Hi, are you in apartment 4B?
Yes, that's me. Did something happen?
Nothing major. I just wanted to mention the music last night. It was pretty loud around 11 p.m., and I had to be up early.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I didn't realize it would carry that much. I had company over for dinner and they stayed a bit late afterward. I'll try to be a bit more mindful of the volume in the future.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Let me give you my number in case it ever happens again, so you can just text me.
Okay, now let's see the question. It asks, how does the man feel about the woman's music? This is a classic attitude question. None of the answer choices repeat exact words from the conversation. Instead, they describe possible feelings or reactions. This is a reminder that attitude questions often require interpretation rather than keyword matching. Before looking closely at the answers, you should already have a general sense of how the man felt based on his tone and wording. When we look back at the conversation with highlighted text, certain clues stand out. The man says, nothing major, and explains the situation calmly. He mentions the music was loud and that he had to wake up early, but he does not sound angry or emotional. These phrases suggest mild inconvenience rather than strong frustration. Paying attention to these small signals helps you understand his attitude more accurately than focusing on the topic of music alone. Now let's evaluate the answer choices. It was inconvenient for him, matches both the tone and content of what he says. The other choices introduce ideas that are not in the audio, express the opposite feeling, or are too strong emotionally. For example, being upset would require stronger language or tone than what we hear. This is a common trap in attitude questions. Wrong answers exaggerate emotions or introduce feelings that are unsupported by the speaker's voice or wording. But the main thing I want to point out here is the emotion words. We can answer this question pretty well without even reading the full sentences. The highlighted words are enough. Inconvenient, curious, welcome surprise, and upset are the most important words in the answer choices. Inconvenient is the only one that matches the man's attitude. To recap, attitude questions ask how a speaker feels about a topic. They use tone and subtle language, not just facts. Strong emotions in answer choices must be clearly supported by the audio, so be cautious with extreme wording. Pay attention to emotion words like nervous, excited, or annoyed, since they are the most important piece that needs to match the audio. We're talking in this video about a type of wrong answer that mixes up emotions and opinions. In general, this is about a lecture or a conversation in which someone has a positive, negative, or neutral opinion about something. And then, in the answer choices, we see it changed. In the audio that you listen to, a speaker may have an attitude toward a topic. Sometimes it's not a strong opinion, more neutral. Then, in the answer choices, that attitude is changed. Very often, a neutral statement is turned into something clearly positive or clearly negative. Other times, a mildly positive or mildly negative opinion is exaggerated into a strong one. Because the topic still matches what you heard, these answers can feel almost correct. But if the emotional strength does not match the speaker's intention, the answer is wrong. This trap appears most often in attitude, function, and inference questions, because those question types are about what the speaker thinks or intends, not just the facts. Before we look at an example, let's quickly return to this lecture on cognitive biases. If you haven't heard this sample yet, go back to the lesson on the academic talk to listen to it there. Now, imagining that we just listened to that lecture, we might see a question like this. What does the professor imply about car salespeople? This is an inference question, which means the speaker said something very similar to one of these answer choices. Not exactly the same, but very similar. When we look at the answer choices, we'll see some options describe opinions or attitudes toward those salespeople. Before we choose an answer, let's take a look at that transcript to illustrate how the test makers wrote this question. Notice here in the transcript the professor's wording and tone. She says, a salesperson showing you cars will start with a more costly option, making later ones seem inexpensive. There aren't strong opinions or emotions. It's matter of fact. Now let's look at how the answer choices differ. The first answer choice is pretty neutral. The words used here, like compare and illustrate, don't show an opinion. Answer choices B and C, on the other hand, are quite negative. Misrepresent, unethical, and take advantage, all strong words. It sounds like the salespeople are doing something bad, and maybe they are, in your opinion. But that's not what the TOEFL is about. The test doesn't care about your opinion. It only cares about the facts and opinions of the material. And this professor didn't sound so negative. If an answer choice sounds more emotional than the speaker, that emotional mismatch is a signal that it may be a trap. The correct answer is option D, which matches both the content and the tone of the professor's explanation. That one is neutral, same as the audio, and is on the correct topic. Answer choice A was also neutral, but the actual content is wrong. The professor didn't talk about comparing features and options, just about the prices of cars. But the point is that a couple of these wrong answers go too far. They change the professor's calm explanation into a negative opinion. To use this to your advantage on test day, always think first about the speaker's overall attitude while you listen. If you hear something that sounds very clearly positive or negative, make a mental note of it. Then, when answering questions, if an answer choice is much stronger than what you heard, eliminate it. If you are unsure because you didn't understand the whole audio or got distracted, it's usually safer to choose more neutral answer choices. This wrong answer trap appears when answer choices exaggerate or change a speaker's attitude. Neutral statements are turned into strong opinions, or clear opinions are turned into their opposites. This happens most often in attitude, function, and inference questions. To avoid the trap, focus on the speaker's overall tone and intention, and make sure the emotional strength of the answer matches what you actually heard.